I'm here doing a little club date. It's the first time it's really the first club date I've done in Los Angeles since I can remember. When I was working with Ella Fitzgerald, she did a couple of weeks here once, many, many years ago. As Lester Young would say, many moons ago. But other than that, I haven't played much, except I did a couple of weeks at another club called Catalina's, maybe a year or 2 years ago. It's always good to come back to California. The weather's always great here. I remember working with one of the finest drummers, perhaps the finest drummer in New York. And I'm sure if he was here, he would agree with me, Stan Levey. He might not agree because he's too modest, but I can tell you. He was working with a group, the Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker group, at a club in New York called Coleman Monroe's Spotlight on 52nd Street, sometimes known as Spring Street, because on either side of the street for a block and perhaps a block and a half, there were clubs on both sides of the street. You could walk in one right across the street, walk in the other, back and forth all night, But Stan was working with the group, and I was lucky enough to be included in that group for a short time. Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and I think Al McKibben, or maybe on bass. But it was a great group. When I first heard this music, I'd just come to town to work ostensibly with Hot Lips Page. And that music sounded so different to me. It was very exciting. It's something that I wanted to do. I'd listened carefully, tried to absorb it. I didn't absorb much of it at the time, but over time, I began to absorb more and more of it, and it appealed to me. I thought it was really the greatest thing to happen for a long, long time in music. So that's what that's what I was exposed. When I was exposed to it, I'd say immediately, that's what I want to do. I lived in Pontiac, grew up in Pontiac, and I came to Detroit occasionally. Like I'd come to hear the great bands. There was a place called Wall Lake near there, and Wall Lake Casino. And a lot of the great bands played there. I heard it in Detroit. I heard the Count Basie band and the Earl Hines band there. Also the Louis Armstrong band there. But anyway, I played a few clubs in Detroit, a couple of clubs. There was a club called the Yale Bar on the west side, I think it was. And I played with guys like Art Mardigan, Art House, and people like that, some great musicians. And it was interesting, I played one club there, on Club 3/6s and it was interesting, but not a long period. I left. Actually, I had come to Detroit after having played in Lansing. I played in Lansing, Saginaw, Michigan, Flint, Michigan, and like that, and also Ann Arbor, where the University of Michigan is located. I played with guys like Ward L. Gray and Lucky Thompson, who also later played with Hot Lips Page. In fact, Lucky introduced me to Hot Lips Page. He was playing with the orchestra at the time, with the band at the time. And he was instrumental in my coming to New York, because I had a job waiting for me when I got there, because he needed a piano player. And he was working at the Three Deuces, which was right across the street from, the Onyx Club, which was right across the street from the Three Deuces on 52nd Street. And I worked there for about 3 months before he went out on the road with his big band, an experience I'll never forget and hope to never repeat in the future. But it was interesting. I learned a lot. And one of the greatest things I learned was never do that again, But it was interesting. Musically, it was interesting. And working with Hot Lips Page was a great experience. He was a great trumpet player. Sounded a bit like Louis Armstrong. And of course, a great blues singer. And Roy's brother worked in the band on lead alto. Roy Eldridge's brother, I forget his name, but it was a great musical experience. But later on, I began to meet people like Coleman Hawkins. I guess Coleman probably had a chance to listen to all the bad chords I was playing, at the Onyx. So he said, well, I can use somebody like that for a while. So he started working at the Spotlight, Clark Monroe's club. And it was to my great advantage, and it was a great deal of help for me, because Stan Levey was also a member of that Coleman Hawkins group. And I believe J.J. Johnson was playing trombone at the time. But it's great, of course, Coleman was the king of the saxophone. And his recording of Body and Soul is still a classic. And it was great working with Stan. I learned a lot from Stan. But Stan was the epitome of the great small combination drummer. And he could also play with the big band, which was, to find someone, a drummer who could do both, was rare, comparatively rare, because there's a different technique involved in playing with a small group other than as compared to a big band. And Stan would be able to explain that if he was here. But later on, there were other groups involved. I had a chance to play with, I didn't work with Art Tatum, but I had a chance to listen to Art Tatum would come to, I'd heard Art Tatum, actually before I came to New York. Art Tatum used to play Buffalo, New York rather regularly at a place called McVan's on the other side of town. I was working at a place called the Anchor Bar on Main Street in Buffalo. Art Tatum would come to town, and whenever we'd finish our evening at the Anchor Bar, I was working with a small trio, and we'd go over to hear Art's last set at McVan's, and it was always a really amazing experience, a learning experience. After Art finished work at McVan's, he would go to either a private home and play for some friends of his, or go to a place downtown, a restaurant where they had a piano that was still open, and he played till 11 or 12 o'clock on the day by himself. That's how he practiced. Great player. All the while drinking Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. Had to put that plug in for Pabst. I don't even know whether it's still being, it's out of business. But he loved it. He drank it by the case, literally. But he was just such a great performer. There's, you have to struggle for words to describe Art's playing. He was in a class by himself. Technically, innovatively, his ideas, his stamina, his speed, accuracy with both hands. Just a phenomenon. And nothing you could say about him really aptly describes his great ability, his great talent. He's an icon. I guess even now, when I listen to some of the recordings that he made during those days, like T for Two, Elegy, and all those things, St. Louis Blues, it's amazing, He had this ability to just completely transcend anything that had happened before. He just created new pathways, and they're still there. Wonderful, wonderful pianist. I'll never forget the first time I heard Art. And later on, when I came to New York, he began to work at places like the Three Deuces. I think the Three Deuces was the only club he worked in on 52nd Street, if I'm not mistaken. But he was staying at some little crummy hotel up in Harlem, just around 125th Street and 8th Avenue. I forget the name of the hotel. I'm trying to forget the name of that hotel. But anyway, Art was staying there. And I would come down. I was staying further uptown in Harlem. I would come down and take Art down to Three Deuces for work. We in a taxi cab. And all the way down, he would be talking about sports. He was a great sports fan. Knew everything about it. Averages, baseball players' names, everybody. Just a wonderful conversationalist. And we'd arrive at the club, and then I was also working at the Onyx Club, so I'd go to work and he'd go to Three Deuces. But it was a great experience. After being in an atmosphere and an environment like that, naturally you meet a lot of the great players. There was a clarinet who used to play with the John Kirby group, Buster Bailey, and he went to work at the Spotlight with a small group. There was no bass. No, there was no drums. Right? There was just a bass, Buster Bailey, and myself. Very interesting group. But Billy Daniels used to sing with the group. But that was very interesting. All this happened on 52nd. Right across the street was Jimmy Ryan's, Dixieland Club. So there was a lot going on all over. I did JATP Jazz at Philharmonic. I did 4-5 tours for them. Now they used to do 2 tours a year, one in the spring and one in the fall. And they cover all of the major cities during those 2 tours. And they had people on, like Coleman Hawkins, Lester Young, Roy Eldridge, Charlie Shavers, Buddy Rich, Joe Jones, Bill Harris, Cliff Phillips, all these people, and Ray Brown. And I did 5 tours, and it was very interesting. And that really led to my playing with people like Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young on recordings, because after each tour, certain members of the group would do recordings afterwards, And Norman Granz, of course, promoted that because it helped to publicize the JTP. And that was a very successful business actually for him. People loved it all over the country. Got great crowds, standing ovations, And it was quite popular. Jazz, I think, Norman Granz, I must say, did a lot for jazz during that period. He probably did more during that period for jazz than any other promoter or entrepreneur, certainly more than some of the band leaders of that period. For one thing, he made it mandatory that the audiences, particularly in the South, were integrated, that is, Afro-Americans and white. He would not play a concert if there was segregation in the audience. And that's one of the things I don't think he gets enough credit for that, because it happened during a period which was prior to the civil rights movement. So he was, in a sense, sticking his neck out, taking a chance, but it worked for him. Because I think jazz was the overriding concern of everybody. People were interested in jazz. They were not interested, at least the people who came to the concerts, they were not interested in segregation and all that stuff, So, in other words, jazz became the bridge. Jazz is the great bridge between cultures, between ethnic groups, between political differences. All those things become secondary when you play jazz. So jazz is really a great dominating force, and I don't think people realize that. They don't give it enough credit for what it really is. That's the stable part. Jazz might change, the quality, the character of jazz might change over years, but the fact that it's there and the people that it's a great uniter. It unites people, which is one of the great things you can say about jazz. And in addition to the enjoyment that you get listening to it. Also, during that period, I was able to, through Ray Brown, who was Ray's husband, Ella's husband at the time, I was able to work with Ella Fitzgerald. Now that was also a great learning experience. I learned how to accompany singers. She preferred the block chord style of accompanying, as opposed to the single line style of accompanying, which sometimes gets in the way of the performer. Actually, you're there to help, to support the solos, whether it be an instrumentalist or whether it be a vocalist, but you're there to support that person. So if you play too many contrary lines, different lines behind the solos, it's going to interfere with their line of train of thought. Whereas if you play block chords, it's like a band accompanying the singer or the solos. So she preferred that style. And I learned a lot about what not to do. I had an interesting experience. I was riding down on the subway one day with Erroll Garner, who was also working on 52nd Street. And we'd started talking. I asked him the usual silly questions about how do you play the way you play and all that. And he told me, he said, Hank says, he said, I learned one thing. It took me 20 years to learn what to leave out. And I thought that was a very profound statement. So you don't have to play all the notes that are possible. There are millions of notes, but you don't have to play every one. Basie proved that, of course. So if you pick out the essential notes, enough to tell your story, to define your ideas, I think that's sufficient. You don't have to overplay, in other words. That's what he was really saying. And it certainly worked for him, Erroll Garner. I did some recordings with Lester Young, as a matter of fact. Now to me, Lester was the most unforgettable character I've ever known or ever seen. He was original in every sense. His playing was original. His method of dressing was original. The pork pie hat, and his method of speech was original. The method he used, the way he held his horn, the tenor saxophone, he held it up in a flute position, like horizontally, and played like that for many years. Later he stopped doing that. But for the early part of his career, he held the saxophone up like this. Had a distinctive tone, which was different from anybody else's tone. Completely original, splendid, fantastic. And I enjoyed working with him very, very much. He and Coleman Hawkins were playing on jazz at the Philharmonic at the same time, along with Philip Phillips, so you had a choice of, styles there, There was something there for everybody. One very interesting and unforgettable experience that I had was working with the great Benny Goodman. Benny was, of course, the master of the clarinet. He was a fantastic player. Nobody can take that away from him, as was Artie Shaw, of course. And I was fortunate enough to work with both of these two great players. I worked with Benny's small band and his big band. It was more interesting working with the small group than the big band. Of course, in the big band, a pianist doesn't get that much of a chance to play. You're playing usually just background things. But with a small group, you're an integral part of the sextet or the trio or whatever. I worked with the trio as well as his sextet, and we did some short tours, not too many tours. Actually, the sextet and the trio played as part of the big band performance. In other words, the big band would play, and then the trio or the sextet would come out and play a couple of tunes in front of the band. So it took place generally at the same time that the big band was playing. We played a variety of things, most of the things that had been associated with Benny, his hit things and things that people recognized. Benny was always very careful to only play the things that people could recognize as having heard him play these things. He's pretty smart. He was not dumb by any means. But there are many, many stories associated with Benny. I guess I could relate one that is fairly, it could relate to anybody. These things happen, and we were playing in Alaska, and it was part of the year where you needed some kind of a coat, some kind of a top coat. And at the time I had a brand new coat that I had just bought, a trench coat. And after the performance, Benny came into the band dressing room, and he walked over to me and said, thank you. That's nice material, I like that. He said, can I try that on? So I said, sure, Benny, go ahead. So Benny tried on my coat, and he forgot to give it back to me. So when we went back to the hotel, I had no coat. And I didn't get it till the next day when we took off for another engagement. But it was one of those kinds of things. You can't say, hey, Benny, give me my coat back, But it was interesting. But on the stage, he was the ultimate performer. Wonderful, wonderful clarinetist. He and Artie Shaw were comparable up to a point, but by the way, I heard I guess you would call it a transcription of Benny and Artie playing with the NBC orchestra maybe 30 years prior to that, and they both sounded pretty much the same as they sounded later. So they both retained their styles, but they were both great performers. I worked with the Andy Kirk big band. Now this was long after the period when Mary Lou Williams, of course, was a pianist. And Mary Lou was a fine pianist and composer and arranger. But I came in after she had long left. But it was still a good band. Andy was one of the greatest gentlemen in the business. And people remember him. I think most people remember him for that. There was never any controversy about him. He never got involved in any brawls. He was always the perfect gentleman. He treated the musicians like human beings, and he's just a perfect leader.
In Kansas City, there's a pretty gal named Mary Lou, and she plays the piano in a manner that is all too new. Here of late she's playing with a band. Let me tell you of this baby and the baby grand. when you hear a hot jumbo. Who's the power behind the mold? It's the lady who swings the band when you hear the saxes ride. Who's the reason why they glide? It's the lady who swings the band.
Both Stan Levey and I were privileged to meet Marilyn Monroe early on. And later, a few years later, when she had when they had President Kennedy's birthday party at Madison Square Garden, I was called to play for her, and her selection was "Happy Birthday to You, Dear President," you know. And it was only 16 bars, but it took a lot of rehearsal time to do that 16 bars. Al, as a matter of fact, Al Cohn was involved in it, as well as another musician from the West Coast. I forget his name. But it took, would you believe, about 8 hours of rehearsal to do that.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Mr. President. Happy birthday to you.
On the final night, I think everybody was surprised to see her there, because at the time there was some gossip about her and President Kennedy, whatever, you know, that sort of thing. But when she came out, she got a tremendous round of applause, and she sang "Happy Birthday to You" in very halting phrases. And then when she finished, again, a great round of applause.
Everybody, happy birthday!
Unfortunately, as far as I was concerned, the compensation was somewhat late in arriving. As a matter of fact, it has not arrived as yet. The interest will be interesting. I was inducted into the Jazz Hall of Fame, which that particular year that happened, I believe it was in Florida or South Carolina. I'm not sure. But you see, I wasn't there, and my sister-in-law accepted the award in lieu of my being present. But that was nice. Also, recently I was inducted into the Jazz Wall of ASCAP Wall of Fame, not Flame, Wall of the Jazz Wall of Fame. And I looked at the name just ahead of mine, and I wondered why I should even be there, because it was Teddy Wilson. I said, what am I doing following Teddy Wilson? You shouldn't speak of Hank Jones in the same breath with Teddy Wilson and Art Tatum, you know. But this was just about a month or so ago. So, you know, I've been lucky enough to get those awards. I'm not sure I deserve them, but I was very happy to receive them. It's a great pleasure to have been, you know, able to have this little talk and say a few words about my early career, which was somewhat uneventful at times. But when I talk about people like Stan Levey and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, you know, I wax eloquent, because these were elegant people, and you know, it's just a pleasure just to remember the great experiences I had working with these guys. So I say, for now, goodbye.